Hi, Linda.
Hi, are you on yet?
Yes.
Because I'm having trouble getting on.
Try to get in now.
Yeah, okay, no, I just got on now. It says join with video. Okay, good. So we're good. Can you see
Good.
me? Not yet.
No.
Okay.
Oh,
You
two
know,
people.
Leah, I realized,
Yeah.
huh?
Two people
You
are
know,
waiting.
we
Yes.
probably should put in that Leah and Debbie Hockman. I don't know if anybody realized that that was your video.
Okay, I've Joanne White is I'm opening for Joanne White. It's okay to let her in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Shelley.
Hi.
They're all muted.
Okay, can you unmute them for now?
They're all muted. You want me to?
Yeah, you can unmute them in
No,
the
they're not muted actually, just Shelley.
Shelley, can you hear me, or
I guess
Joanne?
she chose it. Yeah. But I don't hear you well. Can you talk?
Fine.
Can you talk
Hi.
again, Linda?
Can you hear me now?
Hardly.
Perfect.
Can you hear me now, Leah?
I hardly hear you. I don't know what about the others. Joanne, are you?
Can hear you.
Joanne, hi. Can you hear me now?
I'm
Wait.
fine.
Yes. Joanne, do you hear Linda?
Loud.
Yes.
Linda. Okay. Now it's better, Linda.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. I have Lisa as well joining.
Great.
Shut up.
Great. Okay. Shelley, are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, good. And Joanne, you're on. And Lisa, we lost you somewhere.
I'm here.
Oh, good. Okay. Hi. What's the background noise, Leah? Do you know? I can't hear you now, Leah. Okay.
It was from Shelley, but now it's okay.
Oh, good. Okay.
I mute her.
Okay, good. Okay, so I don't see any faces now. I just see some names, right?
Lisa, Joanne, and Shelley. Yeah, we have 1 more minute, 2 more minutes. We have.
Okay, so we'll wait a little longer. I don't know. What I was concerned about is, will people realize that that was going to be coming from you, the link?
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it's set now that all the cultural arts is under my name, and that's it.
I know.
It was automatically was sent to them.
Right. I didn't think of it until I just saw it this
And you
morning.
know what? She sent it to a lot of people. Oh, they have Lila now is coming.
Good. Hi, Lila.
And
Welcome.
Lenny Engels
Great.
is joining.
Great. Hi, Lenny.
Hi.
Hi. I'm the new Debbie Ockman for a short time. Nice meeting you all.
Nice to meet you too.
It's a pleasure. But I was nervous. I said, "Oh, Debbie, Debbie, Debbie."
I know.
What's going on here?
Yeah, Debbie is in Nova now. She's the director of Long Life Learning Institute.
Oh, she
Yeah.
has
She left us, but she's
She
very
will run an amazing program from there. So yeah.
Oh,
You should all
Debbie left.
yeah.
Right.
Debbie
So we're
left.
lucky we have Leah on board with us. So
Until we have somebody new to replace
see.
her. So I was always her assistant.
I see.
So now.
Oh,
But
that's
nice to meet you.
sorry. Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
So
I
we'll
mean,
wait a little bit longer. Hopefully there wasn't, you know, a problem. Because if the funny thing is, if people, you know, you right away said in the email that the book discussion Zoom was on there, the link. So hopefully people saw that, you know.
yeah.
Yeah.
As long the link is the, you know, the link is the right link, and we are all good, because
Yeah.
we used to have these problems as well.
So yeah.
Linda, what are the next books?
So the next book is The Midnight Library. Did you
Which
read
I
that
read,
one?
it was very good.
Good.
I
It's going to be a very interesting discussion, don't you think?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's The Midnight Library for
It was
November.
a neat concept.
Very neat concept. And then the next one you could even get a head start on is called Eternal.
Yeah, and who's
By
the author?
Lisa Scottaline. Scottolline, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Is it available on audio?
You know what? I don't know, but I know that the library will have copies. So you just have to give
Okay.
them a call and see. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that one is for, where are we,
That's going
October?
to be for December.
December, okay.
December. Yeah. Midnight Library for November, and that will be December.
Okay. And I read the other one too, Infinite Country.
Oh, did you like that?
It wasn't the best one.
It wasn't the best one. Well, actually, what's interesting about that, Leah, that's the one that's going to be in January, which I think we're going to possibly miss, correct?
In January,
Yeah.
I mean, it all depends, yeah, if we will continue with these or not. I mean,
I
this
think we said we were going to miss January no matter what. We go through December, miss
Oh.
January, and then pick up February.
February.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, yeah.
So the library is definitely going to have Infinite Country, but I'm not sure about the JCC for January. But otherwise, we're totally on target for everything the same so far. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't see anyone else coming.
Okay, so we may as well begin. Joanne and Lila and Lisa and Shelley, do you want to turn your videos on even if you're doing other things? You could feel comfortable turning that on because we're such a small group. We'll feel like we're sitting in the living room or something here.
Me,
Okay.
I'd rather not.
Hi, Shelley. Glad to see you. Okay.
Hello. All done, Beverly. I'm in a Zoom. All done. Kathy Rosden is trying to, I see she's, 1 second. Okay, 1 second. Book discussion. How do I register? For November 15?
Oh, she's just signing up for next month.
But she's not here on this, yeah?
No, she came to the library.
Okay. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what
Okay.
happened yesterday was we did the library on Tuesday, in
I
person.
heard it was very good and very successful, and you have
It
a lot
was
of people.
very good. We had a lot of people, and we had several of the Zoomers, several people that usually Zoom. So
Yeah.
that was part of our group that came to that one. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I guess we should begin. And we can talk about the fact that in November, those of you that just did not hear, we're doing Midnight Library by Matt Haig. And I know, Lenny, you had read it. Lenny, did you say Laney or yeah, Laney.
Leany.
Oh, Leany. Okay, wasn't sure. Leany. Okay, good. Did any of the others of you read it? Have you read it yet? Because yeah. Okay. Well, a lot of people really. It was a very interesting book, and a bit like Leany said, it was a really interesting concept. So it'll have a lot of discussion to it. So that's going to be Midnight Library in November. Okay, so and then Eternal for December, Lisa Scottaline. Okay. So our author today is Paulette Giles, and she wrote this book, News of the World. And she was born in 1943. Hi, Ethel, you're coming on board. And Ro, I'm seeing Ro. We'll give them a couple minutes to get in here. Let us know when you're on, Ethel. Can you hear us? Ro, can you hear us? Oh, Beverly. Okay, good. It's Beverly. Hi, can you hear us? Hi, Ethel.
And this is Ro. I can hear just fine.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Good,
Sorry.
good, good,
Thank you.
good. And Beverly, okay, anybody who wants to put your video on, we're a small group, so we can feel like we're sitting together in a living room, okay? It's sort of nice to be able to see each other. But if you're not comfortable, that's fine too. That's the beauty of Zoom. You can, we can, I've listened to many, many different programs while I was in my pajamas, so I know that feeling. Okay. Okay, but if you do feel up to it, I'd love to see your faces at the same time. Okay, so Paulette Giles is our author, and she was born in 1943. She grew up in Salem, Missouri. She went to the University of Missouri. She studied Romance languages there. And then she did an interesting thing. She moved to Canada, and she turned ultimately as a journalist, was a journalist, and then she turned to writing poetry. In 1984, she won the award in Canada, which is their highest literary honor, called the Governor General's Award, for a book of poetry. So she's a very talented woman. And she wrote this book called Celestial Navigation of Poetry. It was a collection of poems. And what they talked about, why it was so powerful, was her imagery. So I thought about that in terms of the writing style of this book. You know, her images were very, very powerful, weren't they? Did you think so?
Yes.
The other thing is she ultimately wrote, and she came in 1992, she wrote a memoir about her family trying to find her roots. And then she made her fiction debut with a book called Enemy Women, which came out in 2002. And again, it was dealing with a young woman during the Civil War period. And this was a woman who was locked up in a hospital, a jail type thing for the criminally insane. But the reason I even mention it to you, it was an award-winning book, number one. But number two, it shows you that the author began this great deal of research and interest that she had in the Civil War period. She is currently a dual citizen of the United States and Canada, and she lives on a ranch near San Antonio, Texas. And, she owns horses, and she has a donkey, and she really enjoys this very Western kind of life. And I would turn your attention at some point, if you have a chance, you could look up her name on YouTube, Paulette Giles, and you'll see where she introduces herself in a brief video. Hi, Judy. Welcome. Okay, guys. If you've got noise in the background, be sure to mute yourself, okay? But otherwise, I'd love you to be able to chime in when we're ready. The cool thing about this author is that it seems like when you take a look at this,
I'm gonna put this on, but
these are all books. Can you see this? That she has written, like, it sounds like she keeps turning these books out every 1 or 2 years. Many of them dealing with the same period of the Civil War. So just to refresh your memory, now I don't know how many of you actually read the book, or some of you perhaps started it, didn't finish it, but just to refresh your memory. Remember, we're talking about the time period, 1870. There's a guy by the name of Captain Jefferson Kidd who travels through northern Texas, and he goes into these small towns and he does the reading of the news. And people pay him a dime. They're hungry to hear the news of the world. He's an elderly widower. He's lived through 3 wars, the most recent being the Civil War, and he's enjoying to a point his ruthless, solitary existence. He gets to a place called Wichita Falls, and he's given a $50 gold piece. He's asked to please deliver this young orphan to her relatives in San Antonio. Turns out that this young girl, 10 years old, her name was Joanna, she was kidnapped. A white girl was kidnapped from her family and taken by the Kiowa Indian tribe, and they had her for 4 years, raising her as one of their own. Recently, the U.S. Army went ahead and rescued her, and they brought her out of the Indian village, and now the job was turned over to Captain Kidd to get her back to the family in San Antonio. And what we know is that this is going to be a 400-mile journey. The territory is unsettled. It is unforgiving terrain. There are highwaymen along the route. There are raiding Indians along the route. There are storms and rivers to cross and everything you can think of that goes on in this kind of a journey. Picture that they're in a wagon doing this journey. So as the miles pass, you've got these two lonely survivors, this young 10-year-old girl, and you've also got this elderly widower. And what this story really is about the relationship between the two of them. So the setting is in North Texas on the banks of the Red River, and it's on the edge of Indian Territory. I'm going to ask you first off, how many of you, what were some indicators of the time period in this story? Like what made you realize when this story was taking place? Any thoughts on that? Well, for
Right.
one thing, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say I think right at the beginning, just by the fact that they were in a wagon, that the Indians were very prominent in the story. And and interestingly enough, the book did not capture me at all until about 3/4 of the way through it. And I got very weepy about it. But the talent of this writer, of her able to describe the terrain and the trip, it became for me anyway, it became a little bit of cumbersome. I was more interested in the characters and what was going to happen to them.
You should know that that's very common what you're saying. I gave this book, we were on a trip, and I gave this book to a friend of mine to read, and she didn't bring a book with her. And she said, Lynda, I really don't want to read this book. I'm not enjoying it. She had just begun it. And I said, do me a favor, stick with it. I don't know about the rest of you, but it does take a while to get into it. And the description, as beautiful as it is, as lyrical as it is, it gets a bit old if you don't get into the storyline right away. And once you get into the storyline, I think it does hold you. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of the time period, what's interesting is, do you remember they're on the road and these army guys come up and they say to the captain, so tell us, do you have your loyalty oath papers? It was such a terrible time. We think of the Civil War. It went on and then it was over. But it was so awful when it was over because people didn't know. Did you support the Confederacy? Do you support the Union? If you supported the Confederacy, you had to sign loyalty papers that you were going to support the Union. So at one point, he's asked for his loyalty, his oath papers. The Texas politics were horrible. Do you remember that in the story? Just awful. There was all kinds of infighting and all kinds of, to the point of violence. The Kiowa Indians and the Comanche had figured out that the Army got their orders, sent their orders via the telegraph. And so they would go ahead and cut the wires, which would leave the Army kind of stranded. And it was great for them because they would go ahead and the Indians would go ahead and they would patch up the wires with horsehair. And the Army people never knew where the cut was. But in the meantime, they could never get their orders and find out where the Indians were going to be. And they would find out, too, where they were about to be attacked. So we know the time period because we also know a little bit about the captain's family. I want to talk a little bit about that. What do you remember about his family? Do you remember anything about his family? So
He had 2 daughters. I don't remember.
he did. He had 2 daughters. Yeah, he had 2 daughters. And he had one daughter who was a widow. She had lost her husband in the Civil War. And the other daughter was married to a guy who lost his arm in the Civil War. So they were already, all of them were affected greatly by this. The girls were living in Georgia. His dream, Captain Kidd's dream, was to have his girls move ultimately to be near him in San Antonio. But how difficult was that idea? Number one, it was expensive to move them, and they didn't have the money after the war. But the worst thing was, here these girls had followed their husbands into Georgia, where their husbands had fought in the Georgia, in the military there. And it turns out that to get back to San Antonio, you had to cross rivers and go through bridges, which had been all blown up and destroyed. So there was really no place to even cross the Mississippi at that point, because both the Union and the Confederacy had blown up all the bridges. So all the roads were all cratered and rutted, and there was really no way to really make your way comfortably from one part of the country to another due to the ravages of war. So we've got these images then of this guy who's got this family. He's on his own right now. His own wife has died a couple of years before, and he was broke. Captain Kidd was broke. He had at one time owned a printing press, and he had a thriving printing business. But during the war, they had insisted that he buy Confederate bonds. So he buys the bonds, he goes broke, and he has to sell the printing press to pay off all his debts. And now his only way of making money is to go from town to town, reading the news. And of course, he would be paid a dime per person to come and hear him. So how do you picture, like when you think of the imagery of Wichita Falls and all of these small towns that he went through, do you have a mental image of it from her story? Remember all those cowboy movies we used to watch? Did you ever watch those cowboy movies? They were great, the cowboy westerns when we were all growing up.
Just
No.
like that, very, very rough places.
Very rough places. A lot of dust, a lot of mud. At one point, he tells the story where their wagon locked wheels with a freight wagon, and it took the driver of that wagon and the captain and several bystanders to get them backed up and free. And by that time, the captain was up to red mud up to his knees, crusting the laces of his old lace-up boots. Picture that the streets were all filled with layers of wood smoke as supper was being prepared in the houses and establishments of the town. So you can really picture the imagery of these towns. The style of writing in this story, by the way, is very simple. The sentence structure. And we talked about the fact that for some of us, how many of you felt this way, that you kind of weren't held by the story in the beginning? Yeah? And by the way, if you didn't read the story, no problem. I want to be able to give you enough of a summary that you really can still participate in the conversation, okay? But picture the fact that she describes in great vivid detail the crossing of the rivers. Those of you that didn't read the book, or those of you that did read the book, how about the fact that the horses had to swim across and they had to push the wagon? And wasn't that unbelievable to go from one bank to another bank and fighting the current? I mean, it was powerful imagery. So that we have these simple sentences. What is it that really held our attention eventually as we got into it? What would you say? Well, Beverly, you started to talk about that. What ultimately held you? What got you engrossed? You're muted. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
That's right. Now I wanted to know, I was anxious. I started to get anxious to know whether he was going to be successful.
Yeah.
Because they had one tribulation after another. So I really wanted to get, and I think that's a good sign of a book. You want to get to the end of the story.
That's right.
To figure out how it ends. I mean, it's not quite like a mystery where, you're surprised at who murdered who, but you sort of wondered, were they going to get there? And was it successful? And I absolutely loved the ending. It just kind of tied it up in a nice little bow.
It was beautiful, the ending.
Yeah.
So tell me though, what else engaged the rest of you? Anybody else?
Linda?
Yeah.
I was concentrating on the girl because she was a young girl. She didn't want to go with him. She tried running away multiple times.
She did.
And he kept pursuing, he just knew he was going. That was his mission. And I don't remember in the book, was it the army or somebody tried to pay him to let the girl go? Could you go over that?
A bad guy. Yeah.
It wasn't the army.
It wasn't the army. No, it was a really bad guy. We'll get to that a little bit, but you're right. But so what you're really saying, and Beverly is saying too, is it's the relationship between the two of them really that
Right.
kind of grabs you. Really, it's this character development that's really beautiful.
Right.
And Lila, was that you talking?
Yes,
Okay. Also, the idea being too, the suspense of was this going to happen? Was this bad
right.
going to get the
right.
girl? So there's
I
she's
was,
very.
I liked the book from the beginning. I mean,
Oh,
it
you
was a
did?
short book.
Yeah.
And I was into it. And just what they were doing, what he was doing, for this young girl.
Right.
And, that's what grabbed me.
It did grab you.
Yeah,
Did you notice, by the way, something very interesting in this style of writing? Did you notice that there were no quotation marks?
right, right.
Did that drive you crazy, or was that okay for you?
No, it was okay.
It was okay. I have to say it bothered me in the beginning. It took me a little bit of time. I had to reread a few paragraphs. But the author, because she's a poet, I think also, she wanted us to really get that smooth, the fluidity of her writing. And so eventually it just becomes like conversational. She says, when you put quotation marks, it's like putting barbed wire around the human voice. It's interesting. That's her take on it. Okay, so what kind of stories did he read? What kind of news articles did he read? I thought that was fascinating.
Mm.
Go ahead, just chime in. What kind of news stories did he like to read? Do you remember?
Yes, things that would help the audience forget about their day-to-day life.
He never would talk about things that were really going on in their own community, right?
No.
He wanted to take them to faraway places for exactly the reason you say. He wanted their minds to be in a different place. He wanted them to feel, that they could hear about strange people and strange events. And he would talk about the Irish that were pouring into New York. He would talk about Hindu women that weren't allowed to talk about mention their husbands' names out loud. He loved to talk about how there were telegraph wires being laid in from Britain to India, about a ship called the Hansa that was being crushed by pack ice in the Arctic. Everything except current politics. And I love this. Why didn't he want to talk about current politics? Well, it reminds me about what a lot of us think today. Because in Texas politics, quote, men have lost the ability to discuss any political event in a reasonable manner. There is no debate anymore, just anger, just force. Doesn't it sound like a lot of our dining room tables, at meal times with friends? And that's the pity. So what he would do is he would talk about all these other places. And he really hoped that maybe at some point people would see that, the world is small, that there's no reason to argue, that maybe there would be more peace and people wouldn't be so quick to take up arms and fight if they heard all these stories of faraway places. So we know that Captain Kidd is this, he's a really good guy. Why do you think, though, that he's asked to take this girl? Why is he selected to be the one? Britt Johnson comes up to him and says to him, listen, I really would like you to take this girl. Why is he selected?
I think he's a good guy,
He's a good guy.
and he does a lot of traveling.
He travels anyways, town to
Right?
town.
He travels anyway.
Right, exactly. Who asked him to take her? Do you remember? It was a free black guy by the name of Britt Johnson. And Britt Johnson doesn't do it himself for a very good reason. He doesn't do it, number one, because he can't afford to do it. He doesn't have anything to haul back so he can afford to do it. But the real reason he can't is that he's a black man. And he knows something interesting. Remember, it's right after the Civil War. He knows his own community. He knows that in the north of Texas, in the west of Texas, it's okay, there are free black men. But what about in the south of Texas? Right. I see you shaking your head no. Yeah, he knows. That's a scary thing, right, Ethel? So
Yes,
absolutely. He realizes he can't be the one to take him, and he chooses the captain. And I love that he chose the captain, because the captain is a very caring man, and he thinks to himself, quote, More than ever, he knows in his fragile bones that it was the duty of men who aspired to the condition of humanity to protect children and kill for them if necessary. And he says, it comes to a person most clearly when he has daughters. The captain thought he was done raising daughters. As for protecting this feral child, he was all for it in principle, but honestly, he wished he could find somebody else to do it. He didn't want to do it, but he realized he had to because there was not anybody else to do it. So what frame of mind was the captain in? So now here he accepts this job. He's going to take the $50 in gold. He's going to buy himself a wagon. He's going to get supplies. He's going to take the girl across down the state of Texas. What's his emotional state when we first meet him? Well, he's elderly. He's lost his wife. He feels untethered. And what else?
He is so far away from his daughters
He's far from his daughters. Yep.
that maybe he feels an attachment.
He's lonely. He wants an attachment. Maybe he doesn't even, might not even realize it, but he's lonely. You're right. He misses those girls. He wants them to come back. He writes to them. Please try to figure out a way to come, right? And get together with me again. But it says in the book that his life had become impatient. He had become impatient of trouble and other people's emotions. His life seemed to him thin and sour, a bit spoiled, and it was something that had come upon him lately. A slow dullness had seeped into him, and he didn't know what to do about it, except seek out quiet and solitude. He was always impatient to get the readings over with now. So here he is. He's a little bit, what's the word we'd use today? What would we say about someone like this?
Bored,
Bored,
um,
depressed.
depressed, yes.
He's depressed. He's depressed, right?
Right.
And it was very nice on the road. People recognized him. He was appreciated when he would, do his readings and they'd pay him the dime. But the truth is he was also a little bit depressed. And for that reason, he goes ahead and he says yes. Now, what do we know about his military past that made him the perfect guy for this job? Do you remember? Well, he had fought in 3 wars, the last of which was the Civil War. And he tells a lot about his personality. When he was just a kid at 16, he had volunteered it was the War of 1812. He was 16 years old and he volunteers. And here he is, this young little private or whatever they called him in those days. And all of a sudden, his captain is shot and wounded, and he's lying out there in the open. And what does he do as a young private or a young guy, a young soldier? Remember?
No, because I didn't finish reading the book. I had a hard time getting into it.
Oh,
And
good.
then
Okay.
finally
well,
I got into it.
Yeah,
Then finally I got into it, but I didn't have enough
you
time
didn't get to finish it. Okay.
Because I
So
got to, but I'm going to.
Okay, good. Well, what we find out is and by the way, even people who read the book, everybody said the same thing after we had this conversation. They all said, you know what, we enjoyed it so much more talking about it because it's really cool when you think about all of the things that the author is really trying to get across to us. It turns out that it tells a lot about somebody if they risk their own life to go save the captain. He goes ahead and he, wiggles himself in and he gets the captain and he drags him back to safety. What does that say about a person? If you heard a story like that, what would you think about that person?
Brave,
Brave, amazingly brave.
yeah.
Also puts other people before himself, right? So he gets promoted. They promote him to sergeant and then they promote him to another job. And he loves the job because why? He's now promoted as a messenger in the army. He's called a runner. And he's finally doing something he loves. He was carrying information alone by hand through the southern wilderness. He was taking messages and orders and maps, and he was delivering it to the different army brigades. And the captain, picture him, he's over 6 feet tall, he's muscular, he really knows those woods, he knows the land, and he loves running and he loves this solitary job. He loves traveling alone, unencumbered, with a message in his hand, unconcerned with its content. Doesn't care what it says. He just is happy doing it, running, receiving instructions, taking the message, and going.
He
So
likes to deliver. He likes to deliver things.
he loves to deliver.
Whether it's the little girl or whether it's the news to
The
people.
idea
that he's
of
talking
deliver.
to.
Oh my goodness, you are way ahead of me, Ethel. That's
I'm
exactly.
sorry.
No. That's exactly where we're going with this. He
Okay.
loves the whole process of delivering something, right? He
Mhm.
loves
Yeah.
delivering the mail, the orders, delivering the mail, delivering the news, and of course,
Right.
ultimately, the little girl.
The little girl. Mhm.
So he's got all of these different things, all of these different qualifications that make him great for this job. So what do we know about the little girl, about Joanna herself? Well, picture when he first sees her in the wagon, Britt Johnson calls them over, says, hey, listen, I got a job for you. Here's $50, gold piece. And I want you to take this girl. And he opens up the wagon and he looks at the girl. And what does he see? What does he see sitting there?
A ragamuffin.
A ragamuffin. She's dressed
A wild-
totally in Indian garb. She's got elk's
Yeah.
teeth around her. She's wearing deer skin, elk's teeth around her neck and beads,
Yeah.
and she doesn't even have an expression on her face that's at all responsive to anything. She's
Yeah.
totally blank, stares at him, right, as if she's going to kill him. And he thinks, oh my, like, really? What did I get myself into? He takes one look at this girl. She pulls a blanket over her head. And when he finally gets her to try to meet his eyes, she's got this blank stare. And she holds herself like an Indian. No gestures of a white person. She's totally still, with, like, he calls it a kinetic stillness that the Indians have. And she's got that. So here we've got this child, and he soon sees she's got all these cultural differences. So what makes her different than a white woman? What do we find out right away?
She doesn't speak the language.
She speaks no English. What else?
She doesn't understand the culture.
Doesn't
a
understand
white
anything
people-
about the culture.
Yeah.
Absolutely refuses, that really fights them off when the women of the town try to put her into white person's clothing, a white woman's
Yeah.
clothing. In fact, there's a very funny scene in there where she all of a sudden goes into the river and she's swimming naked. And a woman goes crazy in one of these small towns and says, oh, what a scandalous thing. She's parading all her charms out there in the river. And of course, the captain says, you don't understand. She's not parading her charms. She's a child, for one thing. The other thing is, this is part of her culture. And of course, we see where she is not understanding. Why is this woman screaming at her? When in fact, she's got these memories of her mother laughing with her in the river, and all the other women laughing with their daughters, and they're all swimming together and splashing and having so much fun. So right away, you see there's all of these cultural differences. What about eating? How does she eat?
With her fingers.
Fingers, and doesn't have any idea how to use a knife and fork. She is told she was 6 years old when she was taken, but she has no memory of her past. And by the way, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, about these captive children. Because by the way, this is all historically correct, okay? The author's done a lot of research on captive children. And the other thing is, even Captain Kidd himself, the one who reads the news, we find out that in fact he's based on a real live person. A woman that the author knows had a great-great-grandfather who did this for a living. He read the news in these small towns and made a dime per person who heard him. So all of a sudden we see this child, and it is heartbreaking. What do you think was one of the most heartbreaking scenes, those of you that did read the book? Do you remember that one scene that was so heartbreaking?
Oh, God.
Okay, so let me try to refresh your memory. So when he goes into these towns, he's got this uncivilized girl. So he tries to get people to watch her when he goes to do the reading. And he goes, he comes into one town, and there's a guy who plays the fiddle. He knows him. He's got a wife by the name of Doris. And he says to Doris and Simon the fiddler, listen, do me a favor. Would you go watch this girl while I go do my reading? And then I'll buy my supplies and we'll take off or whatever. Okay. So Doris and Simon say yes. They fall asleep and she runs off. Do you remember this scene?
Yeah, she runs away.
Heartbreaking.
away, yeah.
She runs away. And where does she run to? Do you remember? She goes to the river's edge And the author does such a magnificent job describing this scene. Picture that it's a storm. So she is soaking wet. And when they find her, she's at the edge of the river. She's clutching a doll that Doris had given her. And she's screaming out across the river because what does she see across the river? There are some of the Kiowa natives.
Right, yeah.
And she's screaming across, calling out in Kiowa, in their language, for her mother and her father and her sisters and her brothers, for her life on the plains, traveling wherever the buffalo took them, calling for her people that followed the water, her people that lived with every contingency, who were so brave in the face of enemies. And she's calling out to them and begging them, get me, take me. And you know what? They can't hear her over the sounds of the water and the storm and the thunder. And in fact, they see someone screaming at them dressed in white man's clothing, and they start shooting at her. And she is so heartbroken, and Simon and they end up dragging her back to the back to the cabin. And once again at the wagon, I mean, she's now locked into the wagon. So we see how heartbroken she is with the idea of living in this wagon. But all of a sudden, we do see some changes. In the very beginning, their journey together, the captain is wondering what made him do it. He thinks maybe he was, senile, that he accepted the job because it's impossible. She's impossible. She's running away. And she's, of course, miserable that she's not with her own people. And so this really starts out quite rough. But eventually, it starts to change. It does start to change. How does it start to change? What makes it start to change?
Learning the white man's language.
All of a sudden, he starts to teach her English. Yeah, she's understanding a little bit more. What else?
Yeah.
She starts to trust him. And she
Yes.
trusts him the very first time when all of a sudden the U.S. Army pulls up against next to their wagon. And she thinks she's going to be turned over to the Army, and she's besides herself. She's hiding in the wagon. And all of a sudden she sees he doesn't turn her over to the soldiers. He sort of lets her hide herself. He
Yeah.
never tells the soldiers that he's got even a shotgun with him, nothing. He just moves on. And all of a sudden, she starts to see that she can trust him.
Mm.
And he, at the same time, realizes he can trust her. You know why? Do you remember why? Because all of a sudden, she comes out of the wagon and she's holding the revolver. And he realizes she knew how to take the safety latch off.
Yeah.
So he trusts her now and she trusts him, and it's the beginning of this trust. He shows her how to use the little iron stove. She starts to cook for him. He's teaching her how to use a knife and a fork. And he's really trying to teach her how it's going to be, because he's going to drop her off at these relatives. And, she's got to be a white girl again. So he's trying very hard. So things are all of a sudden starting to change. And we see where all of a sudden he's starting to get very protective over her, right? And where do we see that? Where do we see how protective he's getting? The first time, Doris, who's a very nice lady. She's Simon's future wife. And Doris says, you know what? We'll keep her. We'll take her off your hands. But he thinks to himself, you know what? Why does Doris want this girl? What does he realize? Doris, they're going to use her.
Use her. Yeah.
And he thinks to himself, you know what? This girl, she is trouble and contention wherever she lands. No one is ever going to want her for herself. A red-headed stepchild destined for the wash house. He realizes everyone's going to want to use her, and he doesn't allow Doris to take her. He's going to continue on to San Antonio to her relatives. The problem is he gets to one town, and Lila, as you started to say, there's a bad guy who approaches him. And what does the bad guy say to him? How much do you want for the girl?
Yeah.
Right.
He
And
wants
he's,
to-
you
First
know
of all,
what?
because blonde and young
Bronze what? Blondes
and young.
young and blondes, and they are at a premium. And at least she's going to get paid for what the Indians probably did to her by force. And he realizes this guy runs a child prostitution ring, right? And he is horrified at the thought of this guy wanting to take her on. And so, of course, we see he is so protective. He leaves in the middle of the night, right? And he practices deception. He says to the guy, you know what? You're right. I'm a little short of cash. Tell you what, let's meet in the morning, and we'll meet in the morning, and we'll negotiate a price for her. Meantime, he gets back to the wagon, and of course, they leave in the middle of the night. He takes a circuitous route. He is really going to try to get away from this guy. He knows the guy is probably going to follow them, but he's going to do his best to stay away from this guy because he's going to protect her. He's beginning to feel such overwhelming pity for this child who has been stolen from her parents, adopted by a strange culture, given to new parents, these Indian parents, and then sold for a few blankets and silverware to the army. And she's been crushed into peculiar clothing. She's all of a sudden having to wear a corset. She's surrounded by people of an unknown language. And she's only 10 years old. So he's filled with pity for her. So now they're trying to escape this guy. And what happens? They're hiding with their wagon amidst the trees at the top of a mountain, a hilltop. And what happens? This was a scary part. Remember this? All of a sudden, the shots ring out, right? Do you remember this part, Lenny? The shots ring out, and the bad guy comes, and his name is Alme, and he's described with these dead gray eyes, like a really scary guy. And Alme is really trying to kill the captain. Of course, he wants to take the girl alive. So he's shooting at them and shooting at them. He's got 2 Indian guys with him, and they're really going to try to kidnap this girl back. Well, it turns out that he's running out of ammunition, the captain. And he says to the young girl, to Joanna, who he calls Joanna by her English name, he says to Joanna, Joanna, get on the horse. I'll cover you. I'll continue to shoot the few bullets I have left, and you run off on that and just get out of here. You just escape as best you can. And the girl will not leave him. She will not leave him. Instead, she wiggles over to him, and this was a great scene. She gives him the dimes that they had gotten from his reading of the news. And he looks at her, he says, Joanna, these guys aren't going to be bribed. That's not going to work. She shakes her head no. What does she do? She takes the dime.
Uses the dimes as
He uses as artillery.
It's so cool. She fills up the shells, which he doesn't have any things to go in there. And the combination of the powder that he's got and the dimes, which fit perfectly inside these shells, he says, oh my God, this kid is 10 years old and she's already a wizard of field experience. She has figured out a way to blow these guys away. And sure enough, he's able to shoot, and he kills Alme, the bad guy, and the others scramble away. And the cutest part of the scene is at the end, the girl, Joanna, starts to scramble down the hill towards the dead guy. Because what does she want to do?
wants to collect the dimes.
She wants to not only collect the dimes, but what else?
I forget.
She wants to scalp him.
Oh,
Yes, that's great.
She wants to scalp him, and he says to her, no. That, you know what? That's considered very impolite. He doesn't let her scalp him.
I thought that would make a great part in the movie.
Right, exactly. By the way, there is a movie called News of the World, and by the way, it stars Tom Hanks as Captain Kidd. By the way, I've heard the movie is not nearly as good as the book, but I am going to watch the movie. I did hear it was, I wanted to watch it. Okay, so you can imagine how bonded they become now. So all of a sudden, they're so close together, and he keeps thinking to himself, worried about something. What's he worried about now? He's worried about something else now.
He's worried about the family and how they're going to treat her. That's one thing.
What's going to happen? Right. What's going to happen? Here's this girl. She's still not civilized, right? These relatives are going to be horrified when they see what's happened to this young girl. And he's worried about what he's going to find when he gets there. Now,
Good
what's
reason.
very important to remember, and this, by the way, is it's a contrivance. And it's the one thing that one of the reviewers said is a shortcoming of the book. Because one of the guys that they meet en route is a guy by the name of John Callie. And he's traveling with some pretty bad company, and they're highwaymen. And in order to get by, they insist on them getting paid, but he pays them off. But he finds out that this one guy, John Callie, is actually a good guy. And later we're going to see that John Callie returns into the scene. Okay, so remember John Callie, because we're going to hear about him again. But he was a good guy who was in bad company. Okay, later on he goes ahead and he apologizes to the captain. We really shouldn't have done that to you, and if I could, I would pay you back. Captain sees that he's really a respectable guy. So they have a lot of different things that happen on this journey on the way home. And one of the most incredible scenes is the ending scene, right? Because at the very end, he finally makes it to Castroville, which is outside of San Antonio. And if you remember this scene, he sees a messenger, a guy, and he says to the guy, do me a favor. Would you go on ahead to San Antonio? And would you tell these people, the Leonbergers, that I am returning with Joanna, this little 10-year-old, their niece? Would you let them know that we're coming? And so he expects that when he gets there, what kind of welcome will he have? What's he thinking? He's thinking it's going to be like a happy family welcoming reunion, right? Gets to Castroville, gets to their farm, and right away there's barking, scary dogs waiting for them. And all of a sudden, what does he find when he gets there? These people. How would you describe them?
Despicable.
Despicable, great adjective. How else would you describe them?
Cold. Unfeeling.
Cold, unfeeling. Every word you can think of along this line. They are dreadful. The guy says, the uncle says, oh, so you brought her back. You know, I gave $50 for her. Did you spend the whole $50? He said, yes. I had to buy supplies. I had to buy the wagon. Do you have a receipt for the wagon? The girl is standing there. Do you have a receipt? He's just distraught that there's no receipt. So he's really awful. And the young girl is just standing there and she's just looking and the dogs are barking and she's frightened. And the captain is trying to say to her, like, you know what, you're going to adjust. Don't worry, don't worry. But he sees a woodenness come over her. And the messenger who brought this exciting news is still standing there. And he looks at the captain and he shrugs his shoulders as if to say, listen, we're not all like this. But in the meantime, these people are really dreadful. And what do they want to say to the captain? You know, it's really good you brought her to us because, in fact, we have a lot of work on this farm. And she's going to have to learn how to do the work. She's just going to learn how to do it. And he says, well, you don't understand. She doesn't remember anything of what it's like to be civilized. Give her a chance, you know, to kind of get acclimated. And these people don't want to hear any of it. He says to them, whatever you do, don't bring anybody else into this picture. Don't invite the community over because she needs time to get acclimated. And he leaves her. And the next day he goes, where does he go? Do you remember? You know that he's uncomfortable leaving her with these horrible people.
He goes back to get her.
Yes.
No, before
But
that.
before he goes back to get her, he goes to the lawyer's office. Remember that? And he says to the lawyer, okay, listen, what can I do? The lawyer says nothing. She either belongs to her parents or she belongs to a guardian. There's nothing else you can do. And these people were her guardians. So he goes back, as you say, Lenny, he goes back. And as he goes back, he thinks, you know what, I'm going to reason with them. I'm going to explain to them. And he goes back and he sees there's all these people there. And what's fascinating is the whole town has come to celebrate her return. But he notices something very telling. Do you remember what he notices?
The aunt and uncle are not celebrating at all.
They're not only aren't they celebrating, but the people of the town are not even talking to them.
Yeah.
You can see they're so isolated. Nobody likes them.
Yeah.
And in fact, the messenger comes up to him at that party and says, listen, you cannot leave her here. There was a nephew who was living here for a while, and he ran off because they worked him so hard. So he lets him know you just cannot possibly leave her here. So he leaves again, and he doesn't know what to do. And he comes back the following night. And when he comes back, he sees her. He sees the lights are on in the house. But where does he find her?
She's sitting someplace
By the-
outside. I don't
Worse
remember.
worse than that. She's walking alone in the dark,
Dark.
and she's got harnesses around her neck with water for the horses.
Yeah.
They're
Oh,
having her gather the horses in the middle of the, as dark is coming. And he realizes these are evil people.
Yeah.
And then he finds her and he sees her. And when he gets close to her in the dark, what does he see on her arms?
Where they beat her.
Whip marks. Yes. They
Whip.
beat her with the dog chains.
oh, well.
He says to her, you know what? Get into my wagon. And he takes her and he takes her away. He saves her. He takes her away. Right. So that brings us now to the fact of the ending of the story. What do we find out happens? What does happen to them for the next years?
I think she goes with him when he does reading and
Exactly.
she collects money.
He goes with her and she goes with him, and it's great. She becomes his little money gatherer, and it's wonderful. It's as if, I love the way the author says she loves the job as if she was born for it. She's collecting the money, and they are known as the old man with the native girl. And he travels around for about 3 years with her. And then after 3 years, both his daughters and his one son-in-law are able to make it to San Antonio. And they come back, and now they're all living together right in the house. And of course, they're researching, trying to get the land back that belongs to the family, the Betancourt family, their Spanish lands that had been taken from them. And so they're all living together, and it's all a very nice ending. And what happens a few years later? Who shows up at the door?
The good guy.
The good guy I told you about. The good
John.
guy walks in. He says, listen, you know what? I always respected the captain. I want to see the captain. And she says, well, the captain's out in the patio. And he looks at her and he goes, by any chance, are you? No, it couldn't be. Are you that Indian girl? And she says, yes, I am. And she, of course, has no recollection of meeting him, but he remembers meeting her. And of course, he's very drawn to her, and he continues to come back. And ultimately, what ends up happening?
They get married.
They marry. And I love the line in there because it says that she got married to him in the Betancourt house, which was the Southern tradition of the time, where the marriage takes place in the bride's home. So you see that it really had become her home. He had really become her grandfather at that time. And it's very beautiful at the ending. You see that I love the fact that the very last scene is where she is with the grandfather. And she says, listen, it's really cute at the end. She says to him, I've never been married before, and either was he. Like, do you have any rules for marriage? And the captain says, well, I'll tell you a couple things. For one thing, he says, I'm going to suggest, he says to her, let me just see if I find this. It's really cute. Okay. Now, rule 1 is don't scalp anybody.
Right.
Rule 2 is, don't eat with your hands. And rule 3 would be don't kill your neighbor's chickens, because remember that scene, she kills chickens, right? And he says to her, as far as any positive commandments, you're going to figure out that for yourselves, and it's going to all be all right. So you see this really loving bond that they have for each other. And of course, what we know is wonderful is that she goes off with John Callie. And why that's interesting is that his job is that he rustles up cattle. So she's able to go with him in the cabin, and she doesn't have to live in a house with a roof over her head. And she can really live the way she loves to live, outside, traveling in nature. So I want to ask you what is the underlying theme of this story? What do you think is the theme? And I'm going to give you a little hint. Listen to this one line that I think sums it up. It's the morning after they almost die in that, what he calls the 10-cent shootout, where she had loaded up the dimes. Remember that? And they killed the bad guy. And he's trying to calm himself from that nightmare that had happened. And he thinks to himself, maybe life is just carrying news, surviving to carry the news. Maybe we just have one message and it is delivered to us when we are born. And we're never really sure what the message says. It might have nothing to do with us personally, but it must be carried by hand through life all the way, and at the end, handed over and sealed. So what do you think he's getting at there? The author is getting at there. Maybe we just have one message.
To me, it was like a lesson in trust.
A lesson in trust. What else?
Both, she had to learn to trust him. He learned to trust her. And they both had to trust that in the end, they would find a way.
That's right. That's right. And they do. What else? What might be that thing when they say every one of us has a message? We have a message. We might not know what the message is, but it's our job to carry the message and hand it over. What might be the message? What
I don't
about
know that things are going to work out and just keep going.
faith that things are going to work out?
I
But
think
what about, yeah.
I was going to say, taking a very common cliche, he lived by the fact that you don't judge a book by its cover, because if he had done that, he would never have taken
He would never
her
take
with,
her on. Exactly.
and that he saw slowly but surely a great amount of depths to her. Certainly, it was hard to remember that she was 10 years old.
Right.
She was very well schooled in survival. And so that was one thing that I saw from him.
Absolutely. That's what I saw also. But there is another piece to this, which is sort of at the end of the story. It says that the last sentence says the captain in his will, remember he lived to an old age, the captain in his will, he asked to be buried with his runner's badge. He had kept it since 1814 when he had been in the army, right, as a runner. And this is what he said. He said he had a message to deliver, contents unknown. So what I think the author is getting at here, and what he's getting at here, is that all of us have a purpose. We don't know what the purpose is in our lives, but we've got this purpose, and maybe our job is only to survive and to fulfill this purpose without knowing what the purpose is. And maybe we'll never know what our purpose was, but we did have a purpose. And our job is just to do it without even realizing what it is. And in this case, he doesn't really know. Was his purpose to save her? Perhaps it was, but whatever, he did it. So this book has a lot of underlying themes to it. Any thoughts on it that you want to share first?
Yeah, I was wondering how the Native Americans would view this kind of a story,
Good point.
from their point of view.
So glad
Like
you
what would have
mentioned that.
happened if the little girl had stayed with them?
Yeah.
Would that
Well,
have
that
been
was
like,
going to
I
be
mean,
my
yeah.
point also, is that they seem to disrespect everything that the little girl held dear. She loved the upbringing that she had with the
Right.
Indians, who survived very nicely without us.
You know what's really funny about that? When I say funny, sad about that is the fact that during the story, if you remember, whenever they would come across anybody on the road, he would say, I'm returning her to her people. And they'd say, how come she isn't happy? She should be so happy. They didn't appreciate the fact that she had been stolen from her family, yes, originally, but now she was stolen again from the people who loved her. Now,
And who she loved.
what's interesting about that is there is a line in there that speaks, Lenny, to exactly what you guys were just saying, Ethel and Beverly, what you were all saying. And the author alludes to it by saying, the bones of their family, the Betancourt ancestors, were all buried underneath the church cathedral. The bones, and this is the quote, the bones of the Kiowa warriors did not lie in the earth, but in the stories of their lives, the stories they told and retold, their bravery, their love. The little girl taken from them by the army, Three Spotted's little girl. That was the name of her mother. So in other words, they told their story, how their Three Spotted suffered. Remember in the book, talks about how she cried so loud that people could hear her for miles when that child was taken from her. And that brings me to tell you a little bit about the captive children. It's fascinating. I started to do some research on this. Number one, in the book, she tells us about the Dutch boy. Do you remember reading about that? The blonde boy who had been taken captive.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody knew where he came from, what family he came from, when he was taken, but he was taken by the Kiowa. And then he had been rescued, and I put that in quotation marks. He had been rescued by the army, but he was so miserable that he escaped from the army and he went back to where he was. He went back to the Kiowa, and he continued to live with them always. He lived there with the Kiowa. So that was a true story. There's another story that I came across, a girl by the name of Mary Campbell. She was kidnapped in 1758 by the Delaware Indians, and she was taken from her home in Pennsylvania during the French and Indian War. Now, by the way, a lot of the times these kids were not, it wasn't just the Indians taking from the whites. The Indians used to take from each other also. A lot of times their tribes were decimated by disease or decimated by war. So they needed to replenish. And plus they wanted other children if they lost their own children. So they would take captive these other children from other tribes. Anyways, this little girl was 10 when she was abducted, or 12, and she lived with them for about 6 years. She was repatriated in 1764. And they said what was really sad about it is that she was about 16 or 18 when she was repatriated back to the Americans, to the whites. The problem was they realized she was probably at that age a mother herself in the Indian tribe. And she probably had to leave behind her own family, her own children when they came and rescued her and kidnapped her back from the tribe. And the story with her is that she ended up going back. She married a white settler. She ended up having 7 kids, but they said that she never had a happy life. One of her daughters had written that she always would go and cry in the woods. And they have countless stories of these captive children that became, well, first of all, we know of 2 of them, this Temple Freed and another girl, that they starved themselves to death when they came back to the white man. They starved themselves to death. Other ones became alcoholic, they became solitary, they just became odd people. They never they could not repatriate. And the question is always, what is it that made them so quickly forget their past as a white and take on this, this love of their tribe? So there's been a lot of, there's been some psychological studies about that. And they're saying, they were so, they really were treated well, and they were at very vulnerable ages. And so they, they took on those attributes of the natives as opposed to the whites. That was one thing. Also, they said for the women and girls that their tribes were very matrilineal and very respectful of women, that they actually had really nice lives in the tribe, sometimes nicer than they had in the white community. So kind of interesting.
Very interesting.
Anyways, any other questions that you have or thoughts that you have about the book?
I just want to know, is there any kind of accounting that's been done of all these children that were rescued or not rescued from tribes over time? Or is this just something that's, kind of lost over
I think a
time?
lot of it is lost, but they know of a lot of cases. There are a lot of cases of these kids that were captured. What they're saying is a lot of the kids that were captured died en route back to when they were going to the tribe, back to the tribes. A lot of them died of disease, that kind of thing. German measles came, when the whites came, they brought like German measles, and that wiped out one tribe that was a large tribe. They lost like 3,000 people in their tribe. So they did capture a lot of white kids. At different times, they wanted to give back the white kids. The Indians wanted to give back the white kids because they knew they would become a target for the army. The army coming after them. Yeah, so they wanted to give back the white kids at different points. But a lot of times these white kids got lost. They either died within the tribe on the way to the tribe, or they were very happy and lived their lives there, and nobody knows what happened to them.
Very interesting, Lynda.
Yeah, it's really
interesting.
That's what I love about historical fiction, that she definitely did all this research. So I think, in fact, the character of Joanna reminds me a lot of this little Mary Campbell, in terms of her physical, the idea that she was a redhead with freckles, the way they described her. Yeah. So
Yeah, the author did a positive twist on what happened.
Yes, but she had and the only reason she had a positive ending to this story was because she was able to put her with John Calley. Because John Calley afforded her a life, although it was as a white woman, she was able to live on the prairie without a roof over her head, not in rooms. She didn't have to wear corsets and, all the other accoutrements of white women of that era.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting.
Lynda, if you like this book, I read quite a while ago, I read a book called 1,000 White Women.
Oh, yes.
And this kind of
reminded
me of it.
Yes.
Also, recently I read Braiding Sweetgrass. Have you read that?
No.
Phenomenal book.
Really?
Yeah. It's written by I don't want to give it away. You'll love it.
Oh, good. Okay. Her book preceding this, almost a prequel, is called The Color of Lightning. And they say that's very wonderful also. So if you like this author, that's something you could look at. So I'm delighted that you all joined us. Yeah, what?
No, what was the one you just mentioned?
It's called The Color of Lightning. Let me look at this here. Yeah, The Color of Lightning. It came out in 2009. And it got great reviews. People really enjoyed reading it. And what you find out is, remember the free black guy by the name of Britt Johnson, who's the one who gave him the $50 to the gold to go take him. Yeah, so Britt Johnson, he was a real person, a real free black man at that time. Yeah, so there's a whole story about him. Simon the Fiddler was a real person in the story. So she did a lot of research, and she plugged in a lot of real along with her fictional characters. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing everybody next month, right? And we'll see you then for Midnight Library, which is going to have wonderful conversation about that. So
when is it, Lynda, if you don't mind?
Oh, sure. That is going to be on, okay, let me just look at the calendar here. It's the third Thursday. So it's going to be November 17th.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
At 2 o'clock. Okay.
And what's the name of the book again?
It's called Midnight Library.
Sounds interesting.
The Midnight Library. And it's by Matt Haig. Here it is. This is the cover of it. Okay.
Lynda, who was the author of, you mentioned The Color of, what was it, Lightning?
Lightning. The same author, Paulette Giles. I have not read it, by the way. I'm just recommending from what people have recommended to me. So I've not read it, but it talks about this Britt Johnson in this same time period.
Oh, thank you. There are so many good
Thank you.
books.
There's so many good books. Yes.
Did you ever hear of the violin conspiracy?
No, but is
Oh,
it
somebody recommended that to me too.
really?
Yeah,
The violin conspiracy?
yeah.
Okay. I like to jot these titles down because we look at them and we're always looking for books. We're going to be working on our the rest of our winter books, our summer books. So yeah, I'm going to just jot that down.
Lynda, you did a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you
You know
very
what?
much.
Lois did a
Yeah, I'm
beautiful
glad
job.
it's wonderful. Okay, well, I hope you'll all come back next week and we'll have, you
Next
know,
month.
Next month.
I mean, right, and we'll have more good conversation. Thank you for your participation also. Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank
Lynda.
you.
Yeah, thank you for doing a great job. Thanks,
Great to
Lynda.
see you guys. Take care.
Okay, have a good
Oh,
month.
And also, by the way, just want to thank you, Leah. Thank you, Leah, so much for.
Thank you so much. I was doing other stuff, but I was listening to. Unfortunately I didn't read the book, but it's very interesting. Like
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I'm glad you're on board and helping us out. So that's
no
wonderful.
problem. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a good month.
Bye.
Bye bye.